In 1938, Tanabe Hajime and Nishitani Keiji contributed essays to a festschrift for Hatano Seiichi, who had recently retired from the chair of religion at Kyoto Imperial University. Tanabe titled his essay Logic from Kant to Hegel, and Nishitani's is the essay serving as the prompt for our workshop, Nietzsche, Zarathustra, and Meister, Eckart. Today, I'll try to understand Nishitani's contribution as part of an ongoing exchange with his mentor and senior colleague, Tanabe. I believe that a proper appreciation for what Nishitani is doing in his essay requires us to situate it in its own context. And this is especially so given the heated discussion about Hegel following the centennial anniversary of the German philosopher's death. Nishitani's exchange with Tanabe, I contend, offers a relatively clear view into what that discussion is about, while raising considerations worthy of serious thought today. The following is thus divided into three sections. In the first, I'll compare the Hatano festschrift contributions in order to highlight a common concern, what I'll call the mediality of freedom. In section 2, I trace this concern back to Nishitani's and Tanabe's earlier receptions of Hegel's science of logic. While the two agree on both the significance and limitations of the logic, they disagree on how philosophy should move forward. So finally, in the third section, I offer a defense of Nishitani's position and suggest that it offers surprising resources for reframing a contemporary debate about the status of non-Western philosophy. Okay, so the Hatano festschrift contributions. Tanabe's Logic from Kant to Hegel. Tanabe's contribution aims to make sense of the titular transition in terms of the good, that is, the concrete freedom of reason. Connecting such freedom to logic is the problem introduced and systematically addressed by Kant, that of the legitimate grounds for cognition. On Tanabe's account, Kant's critique of reason in the transcendental dialectic negatively limits the old metaphysics, while positively facilitating reason's self-awareness as a free subject or agent. Moreover, reason's self-awareness of its freedom is to comprise the contents of a new metaphysics, which Tanabe identifies with the dialectical science of logic. Now, Tanabe is dealing with some very delicate issues in Kant and Hegel scholarship and with incredible abstractness, but the gist of his thesis is relatively easy to trace through his discussion. Transcendental logic implies the priority of practical reason already on the standpoint of theoretical reason itself, he says. And now, for reason to be self-aware is for reason to recognize its own activity in knowledge production. On the one hand, Tanabe says that concepts are standards of social practice, but only to the extent that they are recognized as giving maxims to action. On the other hand, then, these concepts can fail to be so recognized, fail to be actual or action guiding, which sets the stage for Tanabe's conception of the concrete freedom of reason, the activity of creating new rules. Now, this production of the new has a complicated relation to the old. Freedom depends on the old as the negative mediator by which the legitimacy of the new is concretely established. Yet free production depends on the old only to the extent that it recognizes its own dependence on the old. In Tanabe's characteristic prose, the continuity within action's formation of the actual depends on its negation, preserving the traditions of the past as the not being, the matter of the concrete content. In more contemporary terms, the traditions of the past do not have the authority to legitimate the new standards of social practice, are in that sense not being, except the authority granted to them by free creation, or action's formation of the actual. For Tanabe, as a correlate to reason's free creation in history, carrying out the dialectical science of logic, whose content is reason's self-awareness, is metaphysics, the work of the philosopher. The new metaphysics is a practice, and to live the life of this practice is to follow the necessary and sound path of philosophy, he says. We could say that philosophy participates in reason's free creation by articulating the legitimacy of those creations or accounting for normative change in history by demonstrating how the new is both dependent on and independent from the old. Philosophy, in this sense, concerns itself with demonstrating the mediality of freedom. And this is precisely what Tanabe tries to do in his festschrift contribution by articulating logic's transition from Kant to Hegel. Now, like Tanabe's contribution, Nishitani's essay deals with securing a kind of continuity between the thinkers he treats, while focusing on the issue of freedom, and especially the free self. As he summarizes in his conclusion, it's possible to consider Eckhart and Nietzsche as persisting through and intensifying human self-sovereignty through the dialectics of living. Nishitani's discussion of Zarathustra qua atheist and his creative activity as such, as well as his interpretation of Eckhart's breakthrough, both grant a privileged status to the process of negating the old, or the fixed, as part of the creation of the new. Although Nishitani's language is quite far from Tanabe's terminology of standards, rules, or legitimate grounds, The issue he's trying to voice is still the radicalization of human affirmation through human negation. I believe it's very important to recognize that this expression is supposed to be a positive of the radicalization of the dialectical movement of living. In other words, it's easy, but I think misleading, to read Nishitani's language of living or life from the perspective first articulated during his interpretation of the state of the saint. The saint who has escaped the all-too-human town and the bubbling ferment of society. The saint who has turned to his innate natural nature, nevertheless is unaware that latent within his higher living lies a state of thoroughgoing death. Stated otherwise, the saint is not much further from self-delusion and not much less caught up in a mediated image of himself than the mutually mirroring and effervescent townsfolk from which he's trying to escape. Zarathustra, by contrast, in returning to the town from the mountains and attempting to join human living, is the one capable of a life truly lived. The ideal of free creation can only be realized in the problematic realm of social mediation that the natural saint attempts to flee. The problem of social mediation, however, gets recharacterized in Nishitani's historical conception of freedom's mediality. The idea, that is, the ideal of freedom, is a shadow drawn on emptiness, and yet, nevertheless, truly real just as so. As with Tanabe, but perhaps more strongly emphasized in Nishitani, the ideal of freedom is true or concrete when it is in a state of tension and effervescence, which is to say, crisis. The self-sovereignty of human reason, Nishitani contends, penetrates through the bottom of the history of humankind, and Eckhart and Nietzsche, appearing at times of deepest crisis following attempts at reconciliation, also touched upon that current. The philosopher's task, then, is to examine how unreconciled historical tensions motivated philosophically significant deeds, such as Eckhart's theological writings and sermons on the one hand, and Nietzsche's enigmatic Buch für alle in keinem on the other. Deeds whose significance lied in intimating a way of overcoming crisis by, we could say, affirming it as the locus for the realization of freedom. So then, the proposal that history is intelligible, that its intelligibility can be philosophically comprehended, and that what is thereby comprehended is human freedom, is a familiar Hegelian proposal. Below, I'll try to show that while Tanabe and Nishitani have some general agreement about the problems in Hegel's formulation of this proposal, they disagree on how to understand the meaning of philosophy a century after his death. As early as 1925, in Taisho no Choitse, Nishitani was defending Hegel's science of logic as a positive development over Kant's transcendental logic. Crucial for Nishitani at the time, as would be highlighted in Tanabe's later Festschrift contribution, was the freedom achieved by such a dialectical logic, a freedom instantiated in the subject becoming self-aware of its own activity and knowledge. Very simply put, the subject who undertakes this peculiar science comes to understand that knowledge is never a reactive response or mimesis of what is independent of subjectivity, but a response to demands that subjects make on themselves. Yet equally important for Nishitani were the implications of this epistemic freedom when instantiated in the actual world. In other words, at the completion of the science of logic, the subject finds itself to be the sole creator of any cognitive demand to which it could find itself beholden, becomes aware that the not I, paradigmatically nature, has no resources to make its own demands on the I. And yet, human freedom is only actual in reference to a not I. Nishitani here is both impressed and profoundly perplexed by how Hegel himself concludes his science of logic with the suggestion that the idea freely discharges itself as nature. By the early 30s, in Nekshi teki narumono to senten teki narumono, Nishitani would argue that this free discharging is the idea's actualization in the world as the basis for the intelligibility of history. While this, again, is a recognizably Hegelian claim, Nishitani takes himself to be disagreeing with Hegel on how to understand the philosophical activity of comprehending this intelligibility. According to Nishitani, Hegel renders the philosopher into a mere spectator to the Schauspiel of history. Because Hegel, according to Nishitani, comprehends the intelligibility of history in terms of historical forms, irrespective of that in reference to which these forms of human freedom are actualizations, namely nature. Now, Nishitani's solution to the problem is to interpret the idea's free discharge of itself as nature in terms of demands. In this solution, Nishitani is not recanting his thesis from the 20s about the complete independence of reason's own demands. Human satisfaction is sought and achieved solely in human terms. His point instead concerns demands per se. A demand is both the idea realized in historical actuality and the idea's opening itself up to the possibility of such a realization. The idea, in other words, discharges itself by allowing itself to be realized in nature, or more precisely as, Nishitani writes, nature in the world of history. As a consequence, he believes the philosopher cannot articulate the intelligibility of history without at the same time comprehending the real demands at work, what he calls working nature. This is admittedly a fairly abstract formulation of the problem, but I think we'll be in a better position to clarify the details once we've seen Tanabe's own formulation and then Nishitani's response. Now, quite in character, Tanabe introduces these issues a bit more now. In 1935, the third stage of ontology, Tanabe nicely summarizes the same points as Nishitani, writing, "The structure whereby spirit realizes itself in time becomes a difficulty for Hegel's philosophy." He goes on to explain that when Hegel says nature is external to spirit, this does not mean that this externality is something negative to immanence, but signifies an ideal externality on the inside of spirit. It is due to this that the externality of space expounded at the beginning of the philosophy of nature is allowed to lose its unique significance, and nature is returned to an idea. To make a start, the reference to the beginning of the philosophy of nature is also a reference to the end of the science of logic in Hegel's encyclopedia. Tanabe's claim is that Hegel, in effect, does not allow the idea to freely discharge itself as nature, but transforms nature into an emanation of absolute spirit, he says. Like Nishitani, Tanabe contends that history is only intelligible in reference to a not I, and so nature must be rearticulated as a moment of mediation that serves as the substratum. And similar to Nishitani, Tanabe believes that without this reference to nature, philosophy thus becomes detached from history as a form of mere contemplation. Now, how to respond to this shared conception of the problem, however, would come to serve as a point of contention between Tanabe and Nishitani. To begin with Tanabe, his answer in The Logic of Species in the World scheme was to retool logic as absolute mediation. Now, in a formulation incredibly dense, even for Tanabe, absolute mediation is defined by two demands. The first demand, logic demands that every affirmation be mediated by negation. Second demand, logic demands that every negation, as a negation in affirmation, be made the mediator of affirmation. Okay, very, very dense, but let's try to unpack this. The first demand, as Tanabe says, is deduced by necessity from the essence of logic. Now, this is an earlier formulation of a point that we saw in Tanabe's Hatsuno contribution, namely that the free creation of reason depends on a negative mediator. The legitimacy of a free creation rests on its being continuous with the old, in other words. Now, here, according to Tanabe, what makes the free creation is the free recognition, or what makes the free creation free is the free recognition that creation gives to the second demand. So as we said earlier, the traditions of the past, the negation, only have authority to the extent that they are granted authority and are thereby made the mediator of affirmation. Okay, then Tanabe then notes that this free recognition itself seems to belong to the self-evidence of immediacy, seems in other words to be unmediated. But he counters referring to this interrelation of dependency and recognition as a freedom mediated by logic's necessity. Now we can understand this if we recall that Tanabe is retooling logic in order to overcome the inadequacies he perceives in Hegel. For philosophy to be a practice and not mere contemplation, as he says, logic must confront a real externality, something truly extra-logical. Tanabe tries to meet this challenge by distinguishing between the extra-logical immediacy that logic takes as a mediator and the logical demand to thereby take such an immediacy as a mediator. The demand as such does not derive from the extra-logical immediacy, but is instead internal to logic as a practice. Tanabe explains to not recognize this demand is none other than to the abandonment of logic itself. One is, he means, not doing logic if one does not take reason's free creations to refer to something extra-logical. Thus, logic can first become absolute mediation by taking the non-logical immediacy that negates logic to be its mediator. So in this sense, even logical freedom is an instance of the mediality of freedom. We should note that this point is actually quite similar to Nishitani's. So what Tanabe calls free recognition is another way of saying that the logical idea allows the possibility of its realization in the extra-logical. Nevertheless, in the following year, Nishitani would take issue with Tanabe's formulation of absolute mediation and points of controversy concerning Nishida philosophy. By drawing out the implications of Tanabe's approach for life, Nishitani points out, has two senses for Tanabe, as an immediacy that negates logic, this self-aware life that has been negated and mediated by logic. Nishitani then raises the question, that the logic of absolute mediation can mediate even the immediacy of life? Does it not mean that, seen the other way around, the immediacy of life also gives the logic of absolute mediation its foothold? Nishitani's crucial point hinges on Tanabe's two demands. The first demand is, as Tanabe says, internal to logic as a practice. Yet when it comes to the second demand, there does not seem to be anything about the practice of logic that requires it to determine itself as referring to the extra-logical. That is, of course, unless we understand logic to be a practice animated by demands. We could say that Tanabe's solution might help to explain the transition from the science of logic to the philosophy of nature, but without clarifying demands per se, we can't account for how logic gets its foothold in the first place. Put another way, the idea's free discharge of itself, the second demand, is not a logical demand, strictly speaking. And if we do not see why that's so, we're going to have a hard time understanding even the demand internal to logic as a practice, the first demand. And to use a visual metaphor, the beginning and end of the science of logic need to be brought into a circle. Logic as practice is first possible at the beginning because the logical idea has already allowed for the possibility of its realization in the extra-logical, the end. Which is to say, logic itself is animated by what Nishitani calls the dialectic of living. So now it's very hard to adjudicate this exchange without caricaturing either position. In Tanabe's considered account, so long as we're talking about human life, even the immediacy of life involves human thinking and thus already mediated by a kind of logic. Thus, if we're prepared to reject atomistic or contractual individualism, and if we therefore believe that human life is historical and social life, and insofar as philosophy seeks self-knowledge, we have a practical demand to become self-aware of the productive activity involved in social normativity, that is, the mediality of freedom. So when Nishitani insists on the priority of life, from Tanabe's perspective, he seems to end up recanting his thesis about the significance of logic. And if we do that, as Tanabe writes, then we betray what we champion, logic dissolves itself, and the tendency to backslide into immediate life sets in. Now, as suggested above, I do not think that this is what Nishitani is up to. I think the real point of contention becomes clearer once we return to how Tanabe characterizes the contemplative character for which he faults Hegel, and how he thought this could be overcome. In the Festschrift contribution, he contrasts Hegel's Aristotelianism with his own Platonism, a contrast articulated more fully in the earlier clarifying the meaning of the logic of species. Tanabe there is most worried about making interpretation a surrogate of praxis, making it an ontology of expression interpretation where an action has no room to itself, which in Hegel, he believes, leads to a conservative contemplation that maintains the status quo. By contrast, Platonism, as Tanabe's self-professed philosophical path, meant for him that philosophy must seek a guiding principle for praxis. Consequently, philosophy is not only to demonstrate the mediality of freedom, but must also determine, with logical precision, action-guiding principles. It's unclear whether Tanabe actually reached the determinacy that he sought, but I think we can understand Nishitani's concern to be over whether he ever could. In Nishitani's own reading of Aristotle, he'd contend, if logos rules within active living, then it seems to be the determination of that which breaks through determination, the determination of something always involving indeterminacy. Stated otherwise, determination has a, so to speak, self-expressive sense that implies the unity of determination and indeterminacy. Now, it is just this unity of determination and indeterminacy that Nishitani understands life. To bring us back to the Hegelian context, for Nishitani, the upshot of the idea freely discharging itself as nature is not simply that practice involves the extra-logical, or nature in history, but that historical demands will not have the same determinacy that we can expect within a science of logic. They will have a self-expressive sense, proper response to which is what Tanabe denies, interpretation. Keeping this exchange in mind, I think we can now start to appreciate what Nishitani is doing in Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckhart. He believes that there is a kind of intelligibility, a necessity of life prior to the necessity of logic, in Eckhart's theology and Nietzsche's story of Zarathustra. These works express a kind of knowledge and need a path toward philosophical knowledge, even if they leave behind no clear standards, rules, or norms that could be followed. The works instead demonstrate the unreconciled historical tensions of their times, while intimating a way of overcoming them. Intimating, that is, in a way not the same as, but still amenable to, philosophical interpretation, in that way containing a path toward philosophical knowledge. In 1935, Nishitani provided a fuller explanation of his position on philosophical interpretation in Ningen Kaishaku no Nuikeisei to Sono Igi, and he clearly does not believe that the result of this is a conservative contemplation. The true significance of interpretation, he says, lies in being a means for the self-fulfillment of concrete self-awareness and subjectivity, whose content is a schema of self-other non-duality and co-subjectivity. The schema is a determinate indeterminacy, an intimation of what it looks like for us to live together, not in a completely reconciled unity, but still as a kind of non-duality. Now, I'd like to conclude by making Nishitani's suggestion more concrete through a brief consideration of its significance today. Our times have often been characterized as those of perpetual crisis. I believe that the young Nishitani understood that there would be no final, determinate resolution of the tensions that produce crises, that in other words, Hegel's encyclopedia project could never be completed. Yet, in the face of that insight, he abandoned neither the priority of human freedom defended by Kant, nor the possibility of the philosophical comprehension of historical reality defended by Hegel. This latter point, I believe, is crucial for an emerging crisis appearing in philosophy's own legitimacy. Brett W. Davis has recently raised the question, is philosophy Western? And described a dilemma between the violence of inclusion and violence of exclusion. Oftentimes, excluding from philosophy the practices of non-Western traditions is carried out uncritically and with palpable arrogance. Yet, to include such practices too readily can lead to misunderstanding. Now, although he sets up this dilemma, the heart of Davis's essay is an argument for an indeterminacy in our own Western conception of philosophy. We're not even sure, that is, from what we are either including or excluding other practices. Leveraging this indeterminacy is prepared to radically reimagine what methods are to count as genuinely philosophical. Now here, I believe that by focusing on method, Davis has pointed out an important issue, an issue that, at least in Europe and through Descartes, became central with the inauguration of modern philosophy itself. Working philosophers who take themselves to be committed to the methodological revolutions that have since taken place have a genuine task, I believe, in responding to Davis's skepticism. Yet, I do not think that the dilemma of inclusion versus exclusion is the most productive way to frame the issue. With the Tanabe-Nishitani exchange, we've seen specific, which is to say, determinate ways of questioning philosophical method. He departed from a concrete proposal, Hegel's science of logic, and tried to respond to its philosophical inadequacies. Uniquely relevant, I believe, is Nishitani's distinction between different inflections of philosophical significance. Neither Eckhart nor Nietzsche were writing entries in a science of logic, and yet their writings have profound philosophical meaning that demands interpretation, interpretation which itself is not an entry in a science of logic. With this sort of determinate flexibility in our conception of philosophical sense, I don't see why we could not exclude a practice from being logic, while also including, that is, comprehending the philosophical significance it expresses. All the same, to do that, I believe that we'll have to take another lead from Nishitani and Tanabe. Whatever philosophical significance that is thereby expressed must be understood within its historical and social context. To leave such a context out of consideration would be to lock ourselves up in logic, to, as Tanabe warns, allow the subject matter to lose its unique significance and thereby be transfigured into a mere idea. Yeah, thank you very much.
Recently,
oh yes, please.
Recently, I read a very interesting review of one book by another, of one great Hegelian philosopher by another, both of whom I had the privilege of talking with during my stay in Germany about 10 years ago. One is Pirmin Steckler, who has followed up his commentary on the phenomenology with a much longer commentary on the logic. And there's another one now on the Rechtsphilosophie. And the other is Andreas Arndt, who's a Marxist as well as a Hegelian. And Andreas Arndt criticizes Stegler. He says Stegler is trying to make the logic too friendly to existential concerns and real life concerns. And he says the whole point of Hegel's logic is that real life doesn't come into it at all. It is the pure development of logical categories for their own sake. Then if that's the case, which I think it is, Hegel ends not with absolute spirit, but with absolute idea, which is a much more abstract thing. And from absolute idea, he then jumps into nature, which is kind of almost the complete opposite. And it's only in the third part of the encyclopedia that he comes to spirit, subjective spirit and objective spirit. And out of these brews up the ultimate final position, which is absolute spirit. I'm just wondering how all of that would fit in with what you were saying about Hegel jumping from absolute spirit to the world of nature. Sounds like the creation of the world, but I don't think that's really what's going on, at least at that particular point in Hegel.
Yeah.
The transition.
I think this like actually is really close to the issue that Professor Heidegger pointed out earlier, that there seems to be this gap in Nishitani from, we jump straight to human life and it's like, oh wait, what happens to all the other forms of life before, right? And I think part of how we can understand the issue is, at least in the 30s, Nishitani was trying to understand, what makes history intelligible? What is the point of doing history? And in that respect, he saw it very important to bring life into the picture. At this point, though, he does seem unconcerned with, non-living things, though sometimes you see flashes of it, like the discussion of seeing the piece of fish on the plate and questioning who would actually understand how connected we are. But at least theoretically, his main interest at that point was sort of from the other end. So instead of trying to eliminate life out of history, we've got to try to put life back into history. And ultimately, he thinks put life back into logic. And that's his, argument against Tanabe, is that if it's not a living logic, it doesn't have if it's not animated by these demands of subjectivity, then, we're not going to really understand what logic is in the first place. Thanks. And, there's a lot of controversy over whether Hegel himself thought that way or not. And for the time being, I'm kind of interested by how Nishitani is taking this. All right. I think that's a quite interesting approach to it.
And this is very interesting. People that talk about Tanabe and Nishitani together, I mean, one of the first. So this is really, really important. I think that Nishitani had a strange relationship with Tanabe. He was his teacher, but he never referred to him as his teacher. It was always as if most people thought, well, he must have been a student of Nishida, but he was a student of Tanabe. Also, he took a lot of stuff from Tanabe without acknowledging it. This pattern of kind of frustration, nihility, nothingness, absolutely nothingness, kind of you find, and that's already in Tanabe. I found it someplace. It's just in a short passage, but he took a lot of stuff from him, and I'm not sure. The only thing he really wrote about Tanabe was defending Nishida against Tanabe by trying to struggle with Tanabe, but really he didn't write much about his thought. Although, as I say, he took stuff from him. And that brings me to the point about your paper, which is this idea of immediacy and mediacy, mediated and immediate, and life is immediate, and thought is kind of second level. I think that's only one side of Tanabe, in the sense that it's the epistemological side. So immediacy as an epistemological phenomenon has to do with sort of the subject object, whether it's overcome or whether it's cleared, but it's somehow my relation to the world of thinking. But then metaphysically, this idea of Zefkai Baikai is that everything is connected. Immediacy is a fiction. It's a fiction of mind, which we need to struggle with, and that's what Nishitani quite couldn't accept. But it's a fiction that everything is connected with everything all the time. And Nishitani didn't see that. I mean, I had to look at the passage, but as you presented it, he didn't quite see it at the time he was struggling with the problem of immediacy and Tanabe. But if you look at the section on the Keigon Kyo in the religion Shikyo Nanika, that talks about precisely this absolute mediation without using Tanabe's word, about the circumcision of all things. So, I'm very excited that somebody's working on the connection between these two people, and I just think, however, that the epistemological concerns, which were a big issue in volume 6, the Shinodome, that kind of stuff, don't reflect the reason he broke with Hegel, which was about this absolute mediation of all things. There is no universal spirit. I mean, just a thought.
Yeah. That's funny. There's a historian of thought in Japan, Hayashi Susumu, who a few years back had a good paper that was, he pointed out this very issue that, if you look at the history, Nishitani was so much closer to Tanabe, like they were basically, going at it like brothers almost. And to Nishitani, Nishida was more of kind of the scary elder where, you had to really be demure to him. But with Tanabe, they would really just hash things out together. And yet no one's really had a chance yet to investigate what it was they were actually talking about. So I'm hoping that, maybe by looking at this issue of how the centennial anniversary of Hegel's death is one way to look at what those two are fighting over. But as you suggested, there's probably a lot more that they're fighting over in a whole other aspect to examine it too.
So some more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sova. This was really helpful for understanding the role of freedom in this text for me, which was a bit enigmatic, especially in the case of Eckhart, for whom freedom is not a big concern. And even one of the texts that Nishitani cites is not considered authentic by Eckhart anymore. And so this is a comment first and then a question. I think Nishitani is getting a lot of this from the dissertation of Käthe Oltmanns, who wrote a book called Die Philosophie des Meister Eckart under Heidegger's directorship in 1934. And Nishitani cites this text, and her thesis is that Eckhart's all about the problem of freedom. And so she's actually bringing in like early Heideggerian existential categories and thinking about Dasein, freedom, transcendence, and then sort of imposing them upon Eckhart. And so it was interesting to me that Nishitani is also doing this here, but I can understand a little bit more why, thanks to your paper. So it might, I don't know, it might be of interest to look into that connection a little bit more with Oltmanns. My question concerns history and the philosophical comprehension of history. So you say that Nishitani doesn't give up on the idea of philosophically comprehending historical reality. And this is just a sort of genuine question. I mean, is he understanding history as having some kind of end, some kind of closure, some sort of epochal culmination? And sort of it's intelligible because we can philosophically comprehend it in a way. It sort of comes to a close. And if that's the case, is this why Nietzsche is so important here? Like, is he already starting to think about nihilism, the culmination of metaphysics as nihilism? So is that why he's going to Nietzsche already at this point?
So we can think about basically the post-war period when in Religion and Nothingness, he is sort of quite radically changing the language that he uses to talk about history. And I'm not quite in a position yet to draw a connection between those later ways of discussing history and the earlier works. But I can say that at least in the earlier works, Nishitani did believe that philosophy had a charge to comprehend the different expressions of human life. He was quite impressed by Dilthey in this sense, and that there's a way of understanding this, the way that human life is expressed. But he wanted to, he was kind of taking a battle on a few different fronts. So at the time, he was trying to resist a hermeneutic approach that could not reach what he called objective understanding of history. And so he was quite, we could say, insistent, at least in the 30s and even early 40s, that when we try to comprehend history, we're not just contingently picking up stories that happen to fascinate us in our time or that happen to be personally interesting to me, but actually the task of the philosopher is to actually comprehend something that has that amounts to cognition in history. At the same time, he's resisting Tanabe, and he doesn't think that this is going to lead us to any sort of determinate maxim that we could follow in our lives today. But by understanding history, he does think that it is a way of it's kind of a way of cultivating judgment, you could say. This essay that I cited, the kaishaku no igi, kaishaku to uikeisei no igi. In this one, he is quite explicit that the reason that philosophy is necessary for comprehending history is to participate in building, in this process of cultivation. But as I also mentioned in the paper, I don't think that Nishitani agreed with Hegel that you could ever do something like complete the encyclopedia. We're not going to reach a point in human history. We're not heading to a point in human history where we could say that, okay, we finally completed the circle of circles and everything is now nicely bound and ready for print. But instead, to actually re-understand the way that life is, then would mean that you have to permit and actually allow the idea to be actualized in nature, right? You have to allow it to constantly redefine reimagine and rebuild itself, I suppose you'd say. So yeah, there's probably not going to be any nice teleological story to tell at the end of the day, but nevertheless, he does see some way of comprehending historical developments.
There's a brilliant book by Toynasson called, I think, Hegel's Logik des Scheins. And what he says is that Hegel is at his best when he's negative, when he's critical. For example, the second part of the logic is the constant deconstruction of every category he takes up, whereas he thinks that the third part, where he tries to wrap it all up with these syllogisms, is a big Niveauverfall, a big fall in quality. And I thought that was the most revolutionary book, and I'm surprised that Hegelians don't seem to notice it very much. And of course, that would fit very well with Buddhist readings of Hegel. That the power of the negative, you know, the power of the negative, that negation is not something passive and weak. It's the very essence of thinking in Hegel. And when he thinks at his best, when he tries to put it all together in an encyclopedia. Well, I mean, the whole idea of teaching an encyclopedia, you know, of pontificating in Berlin about all things, I really think the late Hegel is not as interesting as the Hegel of the phenomenology and the logic. And my friend Jean Grech was teaching Hegel's encyclopedia in Paris, and about the 16th or 17th lecture, a student raises his hand and says, "Excuse me, professor, what is this encyclopedia you're referring to?"
There we go. Yeah. I think that's the problem that they sensed, that, yeah, this encyclopedia isn't referring to anything anymore. They worried that it was just kind of trapped in itself. And that's why they seemed so insistent, Nishitani and Tanabe, to rethink externality and what it means for it to be a real externality.
Yes. And of course, Marx, you know, is very important to understand Hegel. And do you know, I just discovered by reading, again, Andreas Arndt's review in the Theologische Literaturzeitung, that Hegel wrote an economic manuscript and his brother destroyed it for fear it would have a nil effect. Now, this could be the priceless link between Hegel and Marx. And also his wife was very pious. She destroyed manuscripts he had written on religion. And also Schleiermacher's nephews destroyed some of his manuscripts. So beware of your nephews. You better get your things published before you die, because your relatives are quite likely to destroy them.
That's great. That's great. But yeah, these issues of trying to get the full context of these philosophers in their time. Yeah, that was again kind of one of the aims of this paper too. Just try to think of what were the real demands that Nishitani is responding to, and two of the big people there were, well, of course, Nishida, but also Tanabe and Hegel.
No, it's high octane study. What you're doing is very exciting. Nishitani and Tanabe at it is wonderful. And it's a pity that people go on and on about Nishida forever instead of getting into these live wires, these Hegelians. Well, I would say Hegelian and a Nietzschean. I mean, Nishitani is not a Hegelian, but Tanabe is a Hegelian and Nishitani is a Nietzschean. And in a way, they reproduce the electricity of the 19th century in a different world in Japan. They somehow staged their own battle of giants.
Yeah. It is. It's fascinating when you read their papers. When you see Tanabe making a jab at interpretation, it seems somewhat abstract. But then when you remember that Nishitani's over here defending interpretation, right? And when you see Nishitani, making a jab at the priority of logic and the importance of logic or qualifying logic, you also remember, okay, so there's Tanabe, right down the road, writing furiously about the priority of logic, right? yeah, these issues, these passages, these critiques come a bit more alive when you think about how they were actually butting heads at the time.
Butting heads, yeah.
For me, yes, your talk was very amazing. So, but this text is 1938. So Nishida too was living and writes on similar topics. So the question is, in the text of Nietzsche, study about Nietzsche and Eckhart, do you feel that there is also some influences from Nishida's thinking at that time or not?
Yeah, so one issue that I did not touch on here is how Nishitani actually describes this allowing to be realized in nature, right? And he describes it as basho. So it's the idea discharging itself as nature is actually the idea becoming a place for the possibility of actualization in the world, right? And so I think you can see that Nishitani there is trying to think through from a very different angle, the issue of what basho could mean, right? What is the place? What is the space? That's how I think, going back to this issue of negativity. And so you can understand demands or needs or wants as just a lack, right? But he tried to take this up positively. So demand or a necessity or a need is also this allowing for its own fulfillment, opening yourself up to the possibility of having something fulfilled rather than being closed up and totally self-satisfied, right? Being dissatisfied with yourself in a way and allowing for the possibility of fulfillment in the other. Right? These are the ways that he was reframing this whole language of basho and what it means for things to be in place or in a locus or in a space. So it's sort of opening up of that kind of possibility for realization. So that's there too. That's there in the background too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments from the people
It
here?
just strikes me that
Please.
the headbutting between Tanabe and Nishitani is not just academic, and what gives them the extra depth and the extra power is their Buddhism. Both of them are genuine Buddhists, one Pure Land and the other Zen, even contrasting Buddhisms. So you have a wonderful richness there that I think it'd be interesting to write an essay on what does Buddhism add to the philosophical discussions. Of course, it's kind of obvious, but I mean, picking up their more academic discussions, trying to see to what extent their Buddhism underlies their academic quarrels. Say about the interpretation of Hegel or something like that.
That reminds me of an interesting point about, you were talking about the teleology in history, right? The problem with Tanabe, freedom as a possible teleology. I think for Nishitani and Tanabe, teleology wasn't constitutive, it was normative, it was regulative in anything, right? It wasn't like Hegel, this great end. But what Tanabe had that Nishitani never picked up, I don't think, is that the goal of history for him was self-awareness, not as something could ever finally be reached, but increasing self-awareness. So that was very Buddhist, and Nishitani shares that. But Tanabe in the Zangido added something that Nishitani didn't have, which was the concept of a communio sanctorum. That is to say, a community of the awakened, of the enlightened. He added the social dimension, whereas Nishitani's awakening is always private. That's another element to introduce into the history. Well, the communio sanctorum was a Buddhist idea for Tanabe, but I mean, the term is Christian, of course, but I think it's an interesting point of context. Something worth looking up.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's another issue that you see in Nishitani. He's very good at discussing these existential issues, the way that these demands that he talks about get frustrated and overcome and covered up, delusion. He's really good at all of those sorts of really issues of the interior, right? But when it comes to what he actually saw in that schema that he was trying to describe. Like, what did you see, Nishitani? How are we to live together, right? It shows that, yeah, maybe he was reaching his limits a little bit.
So, thank you very much to everyone.
Thanks for a great discussion.